1940. Detroit owns the world. The city builds more cars than any place on earth. Money pours in faster than anyone can count it. And on Woodward Avenue, between Grand Boulevard and Milwaukee Street, 50 mansions line both sides of the road like a corridor of wealth so concentrated it doesn't feel real. Each house costs more than a factory. Pink granite, shipped from South Dakota. Tiffany stained glass in every window. Marble staircases 3 stories tall. These are not homes. These are declarations. Proof that the men who built Detroit's auto empire deserve palaces. Walk that same street today. The mansions are gone. Most of them. In their place, parking lots, gas stations, empty fields where weeds push through cracked concrete. A few survivors stand boarded up, windows covered with plywood, graffiti crawling up limestone walls that were supposed to last forever. The official story calls it natural decline. The city aged. Industry collapsed. People moved to the suburbs. Things change. That's the version they teach. Here's what they don't teach. The names of the federal officials who drew red lines on maps in 1939, marking entire neighborhoods for death. The exact number of white families who fled in the summer of 1967, 67,000 in 3 months. The fires that swept through abandoned mansions in the 1980s, always when insurance policies were about to lapse, always when owners had been trying to sell for years. This is not a story about old buildings falling down. This is a story about who decided which neighborhoods deserved investment and which deserved to die. About the workers who cleaned those mansions but could never live in them. About federal policies that sentenced an entire street to slow erasure. And about the handful of people today trying to save what's left, knowing they'll probably lose, but refusing to let the destruction happen in silence. What really killed the richest street in Detroit? Time? Economics? Or decisions made by people with names in offices who knew exactly what they were doing? 1894. David Whitney Jr. stands on Woodward Avenue watching crews pour the foundation for his new house. Whitney is the richest man in Detroit. Lumber baron. His fortune exceeds $15 million, equivalent to over $500 million today. He is 64 years old and wants the world to know he has won. The house takes 4 years to build. Architect Gordon W. Lloyd designs it in Romanesque Revival style. The exterior uses pink jasper stone, quarried in South Dakota and shipped by rail to Michigan. The stone is rare, expensive. It glows faintly pink in certain light, unlike anything else on the street. 22,000 square feet, 52 rooms, 10 bathrooms, 218 windows, 20 fireplaces. The construction budget hits $400,000. That number alone makes it one of the most expensive private residences in Michigan. But Whitney is not finished. The furnishings, artwork, and decoration cost another $550,000. Over $13 million in today's money spent on chandeliers imported from Germany, oriental rugs, oil paintings, and furniture carved from rare woods. The mansion becomes Detroit's first residential property with a personal elevator. Electric lights fill every major room when most of the city still uses gas lamps. Indoor plumbing delivers hot water to all 10 bathrooms. Central heating runs through the walls via a system of boilers and radiators in the basement. The entrance hall is designed to overwhelm. 24 feet by 50 feet. Quarter sawn oak panels cover every wall from floor to ceiling. A mosaic, tile floor in geometric patterns. A bronze staircase curves upward, dominated by a massive, Tiffany-stained glass window depicting a knight in full armor. The window honors the Whitney family's claim to English noble heritage, real or invented. The music room contains silk-painted ceilings and hand-carved maple screens that took craftsmen months to complete. The smoking room is finished entirely in dark mahogany. Heavy, masculine, a place for cigars and whiskey and conversations about money. The library has blue tile fireplaces imported from Europe and exposed ceiling beams carved with decorative details. The dining room uses African marble on the walls, hand-painted ceiling panels, and behind a set of Gobelin tapestries, a secret vault, large enough to hold silver, documents, cash. The kind of vault that says you have things worth hiding. Thomas Edison reportedly visited the construction site multiple times. Some accounts say he helped design the mansion's electrical systems. Whether that's true or exaggeration doesn't matter. The story itself is the point. Even the wiring in David Whitney Jr.'s house carries the endorsement of America's most famous inventor. Whitney moves in. He hosts dinners. He joins the Detroit Athletic Club, which sits nearby. He watches the city from his windows. In 1900, 6 years after the house is completed, he dies. His widow, Sarah, stays until 1917. Then, the house sits mostly vacant for 15 years. Too large for any single family to maintain, too expensive to operate. But Whitney is not alone on Woodward Avenue. Up and down the street, similar projects rise. Colonel Frank J. Hecker builds his mansion at 5510 Woodward in 1891. Hecker is a railroad magnate. He served in the Civil War and later the Spanish-American War. After his military service, President Theodore Roosevelt appoints him to the Panama Canal Commission. He also serves as Detroit Police Commissioner. The Hecker House is chateau-esque, French Renaissance styling, 21,000 square feet, limestone facade. The mansion features 12-foot stained glass windows, Italian sienna marble in the entrance hall, a dozen fireplaces, each one different. The house later becomes offices for a law firm, one of the few ways these buildings can survive financially. Each mansion tries to outdo the others. An extra tower, imported stone instead of local, stained glass from Tiffany instead of local workshops, longer driveways, higher ceilings, more elaborate carvings. This is not just construction. This is competition. A public display of who has the most money, the best connections, the most refined taste. The houses become weapons in a war of status that never ends. A few blocks east, another concentration of wealth forms. Brush Park. This neighborhood explodes between 1870 and 1900 as Detroit's industrial elite build their first generation of mansions. The area becomes known as the Little Paris of the Midwest. Ransom Gillis builds his house in the 1870s. Gillis is born in upstate New York in 1838. Like many men of his generation, he comes to Detroit after the Civil War. In 1872, he becomes a founding partner in the dry goods wholesaler Edson, Moore & Co. When his partners retire, he becomes sole managing owner. The business makes him extremely wealthy. His house fills with Victorian excess, carved woodwork on every surface, painted ceilings, stained glass, decorative plaster, imported tile. The house is a catalog of everything money can buy in the 1870s. His neighbors include men who run Detroit. D.W. Ferry, founder of Ferry Seed Company, J.L. Hudson, whose department store will become a Detroit institution and whose name will be attached to the Hudson automobile. Christian H. Buell, owner of an iron foundry. Thomas McGraw, a wholesaler. M. Fife, shoe manufacturer. J. H. Muir, railroad executive. These men do not just live near each other by accident. They choose proximity deliberately. Being neighbors means being part of the same social world, the same clubs, the same church pews, the same dinner parties. Proximity equals access equals power. The houses in Brush Park are packed more tightly than the Woodward Avenue estates. The lots are smaller, but the ambition is identical. Every house tries to announce that its owner has arrived, that his family deserves to be counted among Detroit's ruling class. By 1915, the transformation is complete. Woodward Avenue and Brush Park together form the densest concentration of wealth in Michigan. Horse-drawn carriages give way to Pierce Arrows and Packards. Garden parties spill onto manicured lawns. Winter galas throw light from every window. If you live here, you have won. If you are invited here, you matter. If you work here, that is an entirely different calculation. The cost to maintain these houses is staggering. Heating a 52-room mansion through Michigan winters requires tons of coal delivered by wagon and shoveled into basement furnaces. Staff salaries run every week. Property taxes exceed what working families pay in annual rent. Repairs never stop. Slate roofs develop leaks. Limestone needs periodic repointing. Wooden trim requires repainting. Elaborate plumbing systems break down and require specialists to fix. But in 1900, in 1910, in 1920, the men who own these mansions believe they can afford it forever. The automotive industry is booming. Detroit's population climbs from 285,000 in 1900 to over 993,000 by 1920. The city is the fastest growing in America. Factories multiply. Jobs flood in. Money circulates at a pace that feels endless. The owners of Woodward Avenue believe their houses will stand for generations. They imagine great-grandchildren walking the same marble halls, family fortunes growing larger with each decade, the mansions becoming ancestral estates like the ones they have seen in Europe. What they do not discuss, what the society pages never print, is who actually makes these houses function. That story is lived by different people entirely. On different streets, in neighborhoods, these wealthy families never visit except to collect rent or drive through on the way to somewhere else. The invisible labor that keeps Millionaire's Row alive has names, faces, and addresses. And when the street begins to fall, those workers will be the first to suffer and the last to be remembered.
Every morning before the sun fully rises, the streetcars fill. They rattle north along Woodward Avenue, carrying the people who make the mansions possible. Black workers from Detroit's East Side, Polish, German, and Irish immigrants from the West Side. They crowd onto wooden benches, lunch pails balanced on their laps, heading toward houses they will never own. The mansions do not run themselves. A house with 52 rooms needs at least 10 to 15 staff members just to function. More during the social season, when dinner parties and charity events multiply the work. Cooks who prepare meals for family and guests. Housemaids who clean rooms, change linens, and dust the endless surfaces. Laundresses who come twice a week to handle the mountains of sheets, tablecloths, and clothing. Gardeners who maintain the lawns, trim the hedges, and tend the flower beds. Chauffeurs who sleep in small rooms above the carriage houses, ready to drive at any hour. The exact number of staff shifts with the calendar. A quiet winter month might require fewer people. A spring season packed with entertaining might double the head count. But the fundamental rule never changes. Wealthy families need workers, and those workers must remain invisible. At the Whitney Mansion, at the Hecker House, at the Gillis Estate, staff enter through back doors, never the front entrance. The front is reserved for owners and their guests. The back is for labor. The architecture enforces this division. Grand staircases with bronze railings and Tiffany windows for the family. Narrow, steep back stairs with plain walls for the staff. Inside, two worlds exist in the same building, separated by walls, floors, and unspoken rules. The ballroom, with its polished floors and crystal chandeliers, belongs to one world. The hot, cramped kitchen in the basement belongs to another. The library, with its thousands of leather-bound books and carved oak panels, is off limits except for dusting. The servants' quarters, in the attic, have sloped ceilings, thin walls, and small windows that barely open. The pay is steady but modest. A housemaid earns roughly $8 per week in the early 1900s. The cook, if skilled, might make $12. A chauffeur earns slightly more, maybe $15, because the work requires specific skills and availability at odd hours. They work 6 days a week as standard, 7 days during busy periods. 10 to 12-hour days are common. They move through rooms filled with objects worth more than their yearly wages. They dust furniture that costs what their families pay in rent for an entire year. They polish silver that sits in locked cabinets, used only for formal dinners. They scrub floors made of imported marble, while their own homes have cracked linoleum. For black workers especially, domestic service in wealthy white homes represents one of the few paths to regular income in early 20th century Detroit. Many factories refuse to hire black workers outright. Signs posted at employment offices, "Whites only." Department stores turn away black applicants for sales positions. Banks refuse to serve black customers. The economic options narrow quickly. Domestic service, manual labor, service work, or unemployment. The rules inside these mansions are hard, clear, and unspoken. Staff do not make eye contact with guests unless directly addressed. They do not speak unless spoken to. They wear uniforms that mark their status. They move quietly through halls, making as little noise as possible. When the family entertains, this invisibility becomes even more crucial. A dinner party for 200 guests means days of preparation. The cook works 16-hour shifts preparing multiple courses, roasted meats, elaborate desserts, soups, salads, appetizers, everything timed to arrive at the table at the correct temperature. Housemaids set tables according to strict protocols, the correct silverware in the correct positions, crystal glasses aligned perfectly, flowers arranged in centerpieces. During the event, staff circulate through the rooms serving food and drinks. They clear plates, they refill glasses, they respond to call buttons when guests want something. After the last guest leaves, often well past midnight, the real work begins. Clearing tables, washing hundreds of dishes and glasses by hand, wiping down surfaces, putting away silver. The work ends when everything is restored to its original state, ready for the next day. The workers live in different neighborhoods with different names. Black Bottom, a historically black neighborhood east of downtown. Paradise Valley, another black enclave. Hamtramck, where Polish immigrants cluster. Corktown, Detroit's oldest neighborhood, originally Irish. These areas have smaller houses. Many are chopped into multiple units. Families share kitchens and bathrooms. Rent consumes a large portion of weekly wages because housing options are deliberately limited. Federal policies and private agreements among white landlords restrict where black families can live. Racial covenants written into property deeds prohibit sales to non-whites. Real estate agents refuse to show homes in white neighborhoods to black buyers. Banks deny mortgages based on race. The system forces black workers into specific areas where landlords can charge higher rents because residents have nowhere else to go. These working-class neighborhoods never appear in the newspapers that celebrate Woodward Avenue. When the Detroit Free Press runs features about garden parties at the Whitney Mansion or charity balls at the Gillis House, they describe the flowers, the orchestras, the evening gowns. They list the important guests by name: automotive executives, banking families, the mayor, state senators. They never mention who cooked the elaborate 5-course dinners, who scrubbed the ballroom floors before and after the event, who pressed the formal wear, who kept the coal furnaces burning through Michigan winter nights so the house stayed warm, who polished the brass railings and washed the hundreds of windows and maintained the gardens that guests admired. The labor is essential, but must remain out of sight. The fantasy of effortless prosperity only functions if the effort stays hidden. The architecture itself is designed to facilitate this. Separate entrances, separate staircases, separate living quarters tucked into attics and basements and carriage houses, out of view. This arrangement holds steady for decades. The mansions stand. The parties continue. The same streetcars follow the same tracks every morning and evening. Workers arrive in darkness and leave in darkness. The system feels permanent to the people who benefit from it. The wealthy families assume their staff will always be there, always available, always willing to work for wages that barely cover rent and food. But beneath the surface, pressure builds. Economic forces gather strength. Racial tensions sharpen. The Great Migration brings tens of thousands of black families north from the South, fleeing Jim Crow and seeking industrial jobs. Detroit's black population swells. Housing becomes even more scarce. Competition for jobs intensifies. Discrimination becomes more visible and more violent. The Ku Klux Klan operates openly in Michigan during the 1920s. The Black Legion, a more radical splinter group, terrorizes black residents. In 1931, Malcolm X's father, Earl Little, dies in what is officially ruled a streetcar accident. Malcolm X later states in his autobiography that he believes the Black Legion in East Lansing was responsible. The workers who keep Millionaire's Row functioning live with this violence and discrimination every day. They ride the streetcars past the beautiful mansions, enter through the back doors, and clean the homes of people who would never invite them through the front. They watch their own neighborhoods decay from lack of investment, while the mansions they maintain receive constant care and improvement. Contradiction cannot hold forever. The street that looks so solid, so eternal, sits on a foundation of exploitation and exclusion. And when the pressure finally cracks that foundation, the workers will pay the price first and hardest. The wealthy families will leave, the mansions will empty, and the neighborhoods where the workers live will be marked for destruction by federal maps that make racism official policy. June 1st, 1939. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency created during the New Deal, releases a residential security map for Detroit. The map is color-coded, precise, scientific in appearance. It divides the city into 239 distinct areas, each one rated for mortgage lending risk. Green means best. These are the most desirable neighborhoods, safe investments. Banks should lend freely here. Blue means still desirable, good neighborhoods, acceptable risk, mortgages approved with standard terms. Yellow means definitely declining. Marginal areas. Banks should be cautious. Higher interest rates. Stricter terms. Red means hazardous. high risk, do not lend, or lend only under predatory conditions that almost guarantee default. The HOLC map is not the first document to enforce housing discrimination in Detroit. Private real estate agents have been steering black buyers away from white neighborhoods for decades. Racial covenants in property deeds have restricted sales since the early 1900s. But the HOLC map makes discrimination federal policy, official, mapped, distributed to banks, insurance companies, and real estate professionals across the country as guidance for investment decisions. The criteria for ratings are explicit and racist. Any neighborhood with black residents gets marked red automatically. It does not matter if the houses are well maintained. It does not matter if residents have stable incomes. The presence of black people is, by federal definition, a hazard. Neighborhoods adjacent to black areas get marked yellow. Even if they are entirely white, proximity to black residents makes them declining. Investments should flow elsewhere. The language in the HOLC assessments is blunt. One Detroit neighborhood assessment reads, "Infiltration of Negroes." Another warns of threat of Negro encroachment. In a North Flint area where 60% of residents are black and 40% are foreign-born, the official federal government assessment states, "Undesirables, aliens, and Negroes." This is not hidden racism. This is written policy, typed onto official forms, filed in government archives, presented as neutral risk assessment, when it is actually a blueprint for racial segregation enforced through financial starvation. The effects are immediate and structural. Banks use the HOLC maps to make lending decisions. A family trying to buy a house in a red zone cannot get a standard mortgage. Banks simply refuse. If the family has cash, they can buy outright. If not, they are forced into contract buying arrangements. Contract buying works like this. A speculator buys property in a red zone with cash, then sells it to a black family on contract at an inflated price. The family makes monthly payments like a mortgage, but they do not own the house until the final payment is made. If they miss a single payment, they lose everything. No equity, no ownership, eviction. The contract terms are designed to trap people. High interest rates, short payback periods, balloon payments. The speculator profits whether the family succeeds or fails. If they make all the payments, the speculator gets the full inflated price. If they default, the speculator keeps all the payments and resells the property to the next family. Meanwhile, in the suburbs, an entirely different system operates. The Federal Housing Administration guarantees mortgages for new construction in areas marked green or blue. Developers build subdivisions on former farmland north and west of Detroit. Grosse Pointe, Birmingham, Bloomfield Hills, Royal Oak. The FHA offers these mortgages with incredibly favorable terms: 5% down, 30-year repayment, low interest rates. The federal government guarantees the loans, so banks face almost no risk. White families can buy new homes with minimal cash up front and manageable monthly payments. But there is a condition. The deeds must include racial covenants. Language written directly into the property documents, stating the home can never be sold or rented to black families. Sometimes the covenants are specific: no persons of African descent. Sometimes they are broader: Caucasians only. The FHA does not just allow this. The agency encourages it, promotes it as sound underwriting practice. The suburbs explode with federally subsidized growth. Between 1940 and 1950, suburban Detroit grows faster than almost any metropolitan area in the country. New schools, new roads, new shopping centers, all built with federal highway funds, federal infrastructure investment, and FHA-backed mortgages. In Detroit proper, in neighborhoods marked red or yellow, None of this support exists. Black families who want to buy homes face banks that refuse them. They encounter real estate agents who will not show them properties in white areas. They are pushed into specific neighborhoods where housing stock is older, where maintenance has been deferred, where landlords know tenants have limited options and can charge accordingly. Woodward Avenue, where the grand mansions stand, gets marked yellow on the HOLC map. Declining. The assessments note large older homes, conversion to apartments, changing character of area. Translation: wealthy white families are leaving. Black families and working-class immigrants are moving closer. Investment should go elsewhere. The wealthy families who still live on Woodward Avenue read the signs clearly. The federal government has announced that this area is declining. Banks are reluctant to lend here. Property values will fall. The smart move is to sell and relocate to the suburbs where property values are guaranteed to rise, because federal policy ensures it. The exit begins. Not a panicked rush initially, a steady drift. David Whitney Jr.'s pink granite mansion passes to the Wayne County Medical Society in 1932. The Whitney family donates it rather than try to sell it. The society uses it rent-free. The family even covers the property taxes. The mansion has become too expensive for any private family to operate. Other mansions follow similar trajectories. The Hecker House eventually becomes offices. Some mansions get sold to churches. Some are converted to boarding houses. The houses are chopped into smaller units, grand ballrooms divided into multiple apartments, former servants' quarters and attics rented as single rooms. A 1908 classified advertisement captures the shift. Owner leaving city, offering nicely furnished 22-room rooming house. Alfred Street, clears $200 monthly. Price $3,000 plus. 3 toilets, 2 baths. Bargain. A mansion that might have cost $100,000 to build is being sold as an income property for $3,000. The owner is leaving Detroit. The house has been converted to 22 rented rooms, generating $200 monthly income. This is no longer a single-family estate. It is a business, an investment vehicle for someone willing to deal with maintenance and tenant management. By the 1920s, almost every house on Alfred Street and Brush Park is listed in insurance surveys as a rooming house. The entire character of the neighborhood has shifted. Where there was once uniform wealth, whiteness, and social exclusivity, there is now a mix. Working-class families, recent immigrants, black families moving into areas that previously excluded them through violence and legal mechanisms. The architectural bones remain. The Victorian mansions still stand, the carved woodwork, the stained glass, the marble fireplaces. But the meaning has changed. These buildings no longer signal arrival. They signal transition, decline, an era ending. This is the mechanism that kills Millionaire's Row. Not vague urban decay, not natural aging. Specific federal policies that channel investment away from Detroit and toward lily-white suburbs. The HOLC map draws the lines. The FHA guarantees mortgages on one side of those lines and refuses them on the other. Banks follow federal guidance. Real estate agents steer buyers accordingly. The mansions still stand through the 1940s and 1950s, but the money that might have preserved them is flowing elsewhere. To subdivisions carved from cornfields, to ranch houses with attached garages and picture windows, to places where the deeds promise that the neighbors will always be white and the property values will always rise. Woodward Avenue has been marked for death by federal policy. The execution will take decades, but the sentence has been pronounced. The maps have been drawn. And what comes next will accelerate the destruction beyond what anyone in 1939 could imagine. 1940. Detroit's population stands at 1.6 million, 90% white. The city is booming. the arsenal of democracy during World War II, automotive plants running 3 shifts to build tanks, planes, and military vehicles. Jobs everywhere. Wages rising. Detroit feels unstoppable. The automotive industry makes Detroit wealthy in ways that few American cities have ever experienced. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, Packard, dozens of parts suppliers, tool and die shops. The ecosystem of manufacturing creates hundreds of thousands of jobs. Workers flood in from the South. Black families fleeing Jim Crow, white families from Appalachia seeking factory wages. The Great Migration transforms the city's demographics. Between 1940 and 1950, Detroit's black population nearly doubles. The housing stock cannot keep pace. Detroit has a severe housing shortage. Families double up in small apartments. Basements and attics get converted to living spaces. Overcrowding becomes standard in black neighborhoods because racial covenants and discriminatory real estate practices prevent black families from buying or renting in most of the city. Racial tensions sharpen. In 1943, a race riot explodes. 34 people die, 25 of them black. Hundreds are injured. Federal troops deployed to restore order. The riot highlights the racial fault lines crisscrossing Detroit. Black residents face police brutality, economic discrimination, and violence from white residents determined to maintain segregation. The city tries to manage the tensions through urban renewal programs, but urban renewal becomes black removal. Federal highway funds and slum clearance programs allow the city to bulldoze entire black neighborhoods. The official justification is modernization, replacing old housing with new developments, improving infrastructure. The reality is forced displacement. Black Bottom, one of Detroit's historic black neighborhoods, is destroyed to make room for the Chrysler Freeway and urban renewal projects. Thousands of black families are displaced. The replacement housing promised in federal legislation never materializes in sufficient quantity. The displaced families move to other parts of the city, increasing overcrowding in the neighborhoods still available to them. By the 1960s, Detroit is a pressure cooker. Unemployment among black workers runs twice as high as white workers. Police brutality is routine. The police force is overwhelmingly white. Officers patrol black neighborhoods with hostility and violence. Racial profiling is standard practice. Housing discrimination continues. Urban renewal keeps destroying black neighborhoods. The automotive industry begins automating, eliminating jobs. Foreign competition increases. The economic boom that made Detroit wealthy starts to weaken. July 23, 1967, 3:45 in the morning. Detroit police raid an unlicensed bar on 12th Street. The bar is known locally as a Blind Pig, an after-hours club serving alcohol without a license. The police expect to find a handful of patrons. They find 82 people inside, celebrating the return of 2 Vietnam War veterans. Officers start loading people into police vans. A crowd gathers on the street outside. It is summer, hot. People are awake despite the early hour. They watch the arrests. Anger builds. Someone throws a bottle at a police car, then another. The police retreat. The crowd grows. By dawn, 12th Street is in chaos. Looting starts, windows smashed, stores emptied. Then fires. Buildings burn. The violence spreads beyond 12th Street into surrounding neighborhoods. Detroit police cannot contain it. The mayor calls the governor. The governor activates the Michigan National Guard. The violence continues. President Lyndon Johnson sends U.S. Army troops. For 5 days, Detroit becomes a war zone. Tanks roll through city streets. Soldiers with rifles take positions on rooftops. Curfews lock down entire neighborhoods. Snipers fire at police and firefighters. Police and National Guard troops fire back, sometimes at buildings, sometimes at civilians. When it ends on July 28th, the damage is catastrophic. 43 people dead, the majority black civilians, some shot by police, some shot by National Guard troops, some killed in fires, hundreds injured, nearly 1,700 fires, over 7,000 arrests, more than 2,000 buildings destroyed. The images broadcast nationwide: Detroit burning, armed soldiers patrolling American streets. The violence shocks the country. But for people who have been paying attention, the riot is not surprising. It is the logical outcome of decades of deliberate policy choices: police brutality, housing discrimination enforced by federal redlining, job discrimination, urban renewal that destroys black neighborhoods, persistent poverty in a city surrounded by suburban wealth built with federal subsidies denied to black families. The uprising is not random. It is structural violence erupting after years of compression. The immediate aftermath reshapes Detroit permanently. White flight, already underway since the 1950s, accelerates into white evacuation. In the summer of 1967, 67,000 white residents leave Detroit. The next year, another 80,000 flee. The year after that, the exodus continues. Real estate agents exploit the panic. Blockbusting becomes common practice. Agents knock on doors in white neighborhoods near black areas. They tell homeowners that black families are moving in. Property values will collapse. Sell now before it is too late. The agents buy houses cheap from panicked white sellers, then resell at inflated prices to black buyers desperate for housing. The white families move to the suburbs: Grosse Pointe, Livonia, Troy, Southfield. The same suburbs built with FHA mortgages and racial covenants. Many of these suburbs still enforce exclusionary practices. Some use economic zoning, requiring large lots and expensive construction that price out working-class and black families. Some simply refuse to approve building permits for affordable housing. The demographic transformation is swift and total. Neighborhoods that were 90% white in 1960 become 75% black by 1975. Entire blocks flip. Schools that served white students integrate rapidly, then become majority black as white families leave the city or send their children to private schools. By the mid-1970s, Detroit public schools are 67% black. White enrollment collapses. The schools lose funding as the tax base erodes. The funding cuts make the schools worse. The declining quality becomes justification for more white families to leave. The city's tax base implodes. Fewer residents paying property taxes. Businesses follow the white customers to the suburbs. Shopping centers close. Grocery stores relocate. Banks shut down branches in black neighborhoods, creating food deserts and banking deserts that persist for decades. Detroit's budget shrinks. City services weaken. Police and fire departments lose funding. Street maintenance declines. Street lights go dark. Parks deteriorate. The cuts make living conditions worse. The worsening conditions become the reason more people leave. The cycle feeds on itself. By 2023, Detroit's population has dropped to 639,000 from its 1950 peak of 1.8 million. The city is 77.8% black and only 12.2% white. The demographic reversal is complete. The city that was 90% white in 1940 has become overwhelmingly black, while the surrounding suburbs remain overwhelmingly white. The mansions on Woodward Avenue cannot survive this transformation. The families who might have cared for them are gone. They have sold cheap and moved to Grosse Pointe or Birmingham. The buyers are speculators, not families. They purchase mansions for a fraction of construction costs, chop them into rental units, and extract income while deferring maintenance. A mansion that cost $400,000 to build in 1894 might sell for $50,000 in 1968, or $20,000, or less. The market has collapsed. No one wants a 50-room house in a city losing population. The properties become financial liabilities. Owners stop making repairs. Roofs develop leaks. Water infiltrates walls. Plaster falls from ceilings. Heating systems fail. Windows break and get covered with plywood instead of being replaced. The plywood never comes off. Graffiti appears on exterior walls. Some mansions are divided further. Grand ballrooms split into 4 or 5 small apartments. Kitchens installed in former libraries, bathrooms carved out of closets. The buildings are degraded piece by piece, their original grandeur buried under layers of cheap renovation and deferred maintenance. By 1980, Woodward Avenue is nearly unrecognizable from its 1920 appearance. Roughly half the mansions are completely gone, replaced by parking lots or vacant land overgrown with weeds. The survivors stand in various states of decay: boarded windows, crumbling facades, foundations settling unevenly, roofs missing sections of slate. Only one mansion on the entire corridor has been rescued. The David Whitney Jr. house will be purchased in 1979 by businessman Richard Kuhn. He will spend years and millions of dollars restoring it. In 1986, it will reopen as an upscale restaurant called The Whitney. It will become one of the few preservation success stories on the entire street. The rest continue their slow collapse. Some still have tenants, low-income families paying rent to absentee landlords who do the bare minimum to keep buildings habitable. Some sit completely empty, too damaged to occupy, too expensive to demolish. The street that was built to announce wealth and power has become a corridor of abandonment and loss. The transformation from Millionaire's Row to ruin takes less than 50 years. Not because of natural aging, not because buildings simply get old. Because specific policies and specific events, federal redlining maps, white flight, economic disinvestment, combined to destroy what was built. And the destruction is not finished yet. The 1980s bring fire. Lots of fire. The kind that burns too frequently in abandoned buildings to be purely accidental. Woodward Avenue Baptist Church, a historic structure that stood since the early 1900s, burns in 1986. Investigators call the fire suspicious, but cannot prove arson. The building is destroyed. First Unitarian Church burns in 2014, another suspicious fire. No clear cause ever determined. The pattern repeats across Detroit, especially in areas with concentrations of abandoned historic buildings. An abandoned mansion sits for years. The owner cannot sell it. The property taxes accumulate. Maintenance costs mount. The building becomes a financial albatross. Then one night, fire breaks out. By the time firefighters arrive, the structure is engulfed. The building burns to the foundation. The owner files an insurance claim. The payout exceeds what the property could have sold for. The lot is cleared and sold. Proving arson is difficult. Abandoned buildings have deteriorating electrical systems that can spark fires. Squatters and homeless people use them for shelter and sometimes start fires for warmth. Vandals break in. Kids explore and play with matches. Legitimate causes exist. But the timing raises questions. Buildings that have been financial burdens for years suddenly burn just before insurance policies lapse. Structures that owners have been trying unsuccessfully to sell disappear in flames. Properties that sit on land developers want for other projects burn and then sell quickly as vacant lots. Detroit firefighters battle suspicious fires throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The department is understaffed and underfunded. Response times increase. Equipment ages without replacement. Firefighters arrive at burning mansions and watch them collapse, knowing there are not enough resources to save structures this large. Arson becomes an urban removal strategy, faster than demolition, cheaper than preservation. The buildings vanish. The lots clear. The tax assessor reduces the property value. The owner pays less in taxes and waits for a buyer willing to develop the empty land. The city responds with its own demolition program. Hundreds of structures in Brush Park and along Woodward Avenue are razed by city order. The justification is public safety. Buildings are structurally unsound, roofs collapsing, walls leaning, windows broken. Squatters and drug users occupy them. The structures have become dangerous nuisances. But demolition also erases history. In 1936, the Philo Parsons Mansion is demolished to widen Woodward Avenue. The city needs land for additional traffic lanes. A Victorian architectural masterpiece, one of the finest houses in Brush Park, is destroyed to make room for cars. The decision reflects the priorities of the era. Automotive transportation matters more than historic preservation. The 1960s bring urban renewal and freeway construction, which accelerate the destruction. The Fisher Freeway, Interstate 375, is carved through the southern section of Brush Park. Entire city blocks vanish under concrete and asphalt. The original High Street simply disappears, buried under the freeway. Dozens of mansions are demolished. Hundreds of families are displaced. Federal highway funds pay for the construction. The same federal government that redlined Detroit's black neighborhoods now bulldozes them to build freeways that make it easier for suburban white residents to commute to downtown jobs without living in the city. The displaced families have to find housing elsewhere. But the areas available to black families are limited by ongoing discrimination. Overcrowding increases. Housing quality declines. The cycle of disinvestment and displacement continues. By 1987, most of the Woodward Avenue mansions still standing are completely vacant. Boards cover every window. Doors are sealed or kicked in repeatedly by vandals. Graffiti covers the lower walls. Inside, copper pipes have been stripped by scavengers. Brass fixtures removed. Anything valuable enough to sell is gone. Small fires start and die out inside the buildings, leaving black scars on walls and ceilings. Kids break in to explore. Urban explorers photograph the decay. Drug users find shelter. Police occasionally sweep the buildings but cannot maintain a presence. The structures are too numerous and the police force too small. The mansions become artifacts of ruin. Roofs open to the sky. Staircases that once gleamed under polish now sag and splinter. Marble fireplaces crack from freeze-thaw cycles as winter weather penetrates the unheated buildings. Stained glass windows that were not stolen decades earlier break from neglect. Rain and snow blow through openings. Water pools on floors. Mold spreads. The city talks about demolition repeatedly, but demolishing a mansion costs money. A large structure with stone walls and deep foundations requires significant equipment and labor. The city budget cannot cover demolition of every abandoned building. So the houses stand, waiting, slowly disintegrating. Some get demolished eventually. The Henderson Mansion comes down. The Wilson Estate is razed. The Crawford House burns in a suspicious fire. Then the ruins are bulldozed. One by one, the mansions disappear. What is left by 1990? On Brush Park, perhaps a dozen houses survive, out of what was once a dense neighborhood of hundreds of Victorian mansions. On Woodward Avenue, the count is similar. The David Whitney Jr. house, saved and operating as a restaurant. A handful of others in various states of abandonment. Empty lots and parking spaces where the rest once stood. The Detroit Land Bank Authority eventually owns about 75,000 parcels across the city. Most are vacant lots, former house sites, former mansion sites, ground that once held structures worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, now assessed as nearly worthless. Land that generates no tax revenue, land that costs the city money to maintain and monitor. This is what erasure looks like. Not sudden, not dramatic, just steady, grinding loss. Year after year, building after building, fire after fire, demolition after demolition, until the street that was Detroit's richest has been reduced mostly to empty space and fading memory. The crime is not just the physical loss. It is how thoroughly the destruction was enabled by policy. Federal redlining that starved neighborhoods of investment, white flight that drained the tax base, budget cuts that eliminated city services, and a cultural acceptance that black neighborhoods are disposable, that buildings in black areas do not deserve preservation, that history only matters if it happened in white spaces. Millionaire's Row died because people in power decided it should die, and they made that decision easier by ensuring that no one with resources or influence had reason to fight for its survival. Not everything died. A few mansions survived, not many. The odds were terrible. But enough made it to prove that survival was possible with the right combination of timing, money, and determination. The David Whitney Jr. mansion at 4421 Woodward Avenue stands as the clearest success story. After Whitney's death in 1900 and his widow's departure in 1917, the house sat mostly vacant until 1932. That year, the Wayne County Medical Society moved in rent-free. The Whitney estate even covered property taxes. The arrangement lasted until 1956. In 1957, the Visiting Nurse Association purchased the building for $150,000. They had been using the carriage house since 1929 and wanted the main structure. The VNA occupied the mansion for over 2 decades, using it for offices and medical services. In 1979, Detroit businessman Richard Kuhn purchased the property. Kuhn owned a successful business and had resources to invest in restoration. He also had vision. He understood that the building could become something beyond offices. It could be a destination. The restoration was extensive and expensive. The pink jasper stone facade was cleaned, removing decades of grime and pollution stains. Damaged stones were repaired or replaced with matching material. The roof was completely rebuilt. The interior underwent floor-by-floor renovation. Kuhn's team restored the Tiffany stained glass windows. They refinished the quarter-sawn oak paneling. They repaired the mosaic tile floors. They rebuilt plasterwork where it had fallen. They restored fireplaces, repaired the bronze staircase, and brought back the mansion's original grandeur. The project took years. The cost ran into millions. But in 1986, the mansion reopened as the Whitney, an upscale restaurant. The building works. It generates revenue through dinner service, private events, and weddings. It employs staff. It pays property taxes. It contributes to the local economy. More importantly, it proves that adaptive reuse can save historic structures. The building is not a museum frozen in time. It is a working restaurant where people eat, celebrate, and create new memories in spaces that have witnessed over a century of Detroit's history. In 2007, Kuhn sold the property to Arthur Bud Liebler, a former Chrysler executive, for more than $2 million. The restaurant continues to operate. The building remains one of Woodward Avenue's most prominent landmarks. In Brush Park, a few other mansions survived through similar paths. The Ransom Gillis House, one of the neighborhood's most elaborate Victorian mansions, underwent restoration. The Frederick Butler House was converted to luxury condominiums in 2006. The Lucian Moore House received complete restoration. The John Harvey House reopened as the Inn at 97 Winder, a bed and breakfast. These restorations required significant capital investment. Restoring a Victorian mansion in Detroit typically costs between $2 million and $5 million, depending on the building's condition. The work requires specialized craftspeople who understand historic construction techniques, stonemasons who can match original materials, plasterers who can recreate Victorian ornamental work, carpenters skilled in period joinery. The economics only work with a combination of factors. Historic preservation tax credits reduce costs. These federal and state tax incentives can cover 20 to 40% of qualified rehabilitation expenses. But the owner must have tax liability to benefit from the credits. Wealthy individuals or profitable companies can use the credits effectively. Nonprofits cannot. Public pressure helps. Community organizations that advocate loudly for preservation can slow demolition and create political pressure for alternatives. Media coverage brings attention. Petitions demonstrate public support. City officials face harder choices when constituents are watching and demanding preservation. Legal protections matter enormously. On September 17, 1974, Woodward East Historic District received Michigan State Historic Site designation. On January 21, 1975, it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. On January 23, 1980, Detroit established the larger Brush Park Historic District. These designations provide legal protection. Demolition in historic districts requires special approval. Public hearings must be held. Alternative preservation options must be considered. Community input carries weight. The process creates obstacles for developers who want quick demolition. But the protections arrived too late for most buildings. The Woodward Avenue mansions demolished in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s had no legal protection. By the time historic districts were established, most of the damage was already done. The protections save what remains, but cannot resurrect what is already gone. In the 1990s and 2000s, private investors slowly began buying and restoring individual mansions in Brush Park. Some became private residences, again. Some became offices for small businesses, law firms, or architecture studios. Some became event spaces for weddings and corporate functions. Dan Gilbert's Bedrock Real Estate, the development company owned by the billionaire founder of Quicken Loans, announced a $70 million Brush Park development plan in the 2010s. The plan mixed new construction with restoration of surviving historic homes. The goal was to rebuild Brush Park as a walkable urban neighborhood, not a museum district. New townhouses rose on vacant lots. Restored Victorian mansions sold as high-end residences. The neighborhood began attracting young professionals working in downtown Detroit's revitalized core. The development was controversial. Some praised it as neighborhood revival. Others criticized it as gentrification displacing low-income residents. The pattern that emerges from all these preservation efforts is stark. You save one mansion out of every 12 or 15 if you are very lucky. You fight for years. You need financing, legal help, community support, political will, and favorable timing. Most fights end in loss. Occasionally, one building makes it through. The survivors matter not just as architecture. They prove that destruction was not inevitable, that with different choices, with different priorities, with different policies, more could have been saved. The erasure of Millionaire's Row was not natural decline. It was a series of decisions made by people with names in positions with titles, federal officials at HOLC who drew the redlining maps, FHA administrators who approved racially restrictive covenants, Detroit city planners who approved freeway routes through black neighborhoods. Building inspectors who condemned structures instead of requiring repairs. Developers who demolished rather than restored. Each decision had an alternative. The maps could have been drawn differently. The FHA could have rejected racial covenants. The freeways could have followed different routes. Building codes could have incentivized preservation. Developers could have been required to restore rather than demolish. Different choices would have produced different outcomes. Some mansions would still have been lost. Buildings do age. Maintenance is expensive. Economic shifts happen. But the wholesale erasure of Millionaire's Row required wholesale policy failures. And those failures were not accidents. They were choices. Today, if you walk Woodward Avenue, you see the gaps more than the buildings. Empty lots, parking, a gas station, a storage facility. And scattered among the absences, a few mansions. The Whitney, glowing warm with restaurant light. A few others, some restored, some still boarded and waiting. The street will never be what it was. The corridor of 50 mansions is gone forever. But what remains stands as evidence. Evidence of what Detroit built when automotive wealth was flowing. Evidence of what Detroit lost when federal policies and white flight drained resources. Evidence that survival is possible but never guaranteed, and evidence that forgetting is a choice we keep making. The crime is not that the mansions fell. Buildings fall. Steel rusts. Stone cracks. Wood rots. Maintenance costs money. Cities change. That is the nature of the built environment. Nothing lasts forever without constant investment. The crime is how deliberately we made the destruction happen, and how thoroughly we have forgotten the mechanism. Start with the numbers. June 1st, 1939. The Homeowners Loan Corporation releases residential security maps for 239 neighborhoods in Detroit. The maps are color-coded based on mortgage risk. Any neighborhood with black residents is marked red. Hazardous. Do not lend. That is not interpretation. That is documented federal policy. The HOLC assessment forms include printed categories for racial composition. The assessors write down observations about infiltration of Negroes and threat of Negro encroachment. These documents exist in archives. Anyone can read them. The maps go to banks. The banks follow them. Black families trying to buy homes in Detroit cannot get standard mortgages, not because they have bad credit, not because they lack income, because federal policy declares their neighborhoods hazardous, based solely on race. Meanwhile, the Federal Housing Administration guarantees mortgages for white families buying new homes in suburbs where deeds prohibit sales to black buyers. Between 1934 and 1962, the FHA backs $120 billion in home loans. Less than 2% goes to black families. The government subsidizes white suburban wealth while denying the same support to black urban residents. July 23 through 28, 1967. Detroit burns. 43 people die. 1,700 fires, 7,000 arrests. 67,000 white residents flee in the 3 months following the riot. Another 80,000 leave the following year. These are not estimates. These are census figures. Documented population changes. The white flight that hollows out Detroit's tax base is measurable and measured. The mansions on Woodward Avenue cannot survive the loss of their natural constituency. The wealthy white families who built them are gone. They have moved to Grosse Pointe, where racial covenants ensure their neighbors will look like them. The black families moving into Detroit face redlining, job discrimination, and systematic disinvestment. They cannot afford to maintain 50-room mansions with failing infrastructure. 1980s to 1990s. Suspicious fires sweep through abandoned buildings. Woodward Avenue Baptist Church, 1986. First Unitarian Church, 2014. Dozens of Victorian mansions in Brush Park. The pattern is consistent. Buildings that are financial burdens catch fire. Owners collect insurance money. Lots are cleared and sold. Proving specific arson cases is difficult, but the aggregate pattern is clear. Fire becomes an urban removal strategy, faster than official demolition, cheaper than preservation. The buildings disappear. The lots become parking or vacant land. The history vanishes. By 2024, Detroit has lost roughly 85 to 90% of its Millionaire's Row mansions. Of the 50 or so grand houses that lined Woodward Avenue in 1920, maybe 5 to 8 survive in recognizable form. The rest are gone, demolished, burned, collapsed from neglect. That is the crime, not theoretical decline, not inevitable aging. Specific policies applied by specific agencies producing specific, documented outcomes. The second crime is the forgetting. The way we talk about Detroit's decline as if it happened naturally, as if cities just age and die without human decisions driving the process. The official narrative goes like this. Detroit boomed during the automotive era. Then the industry declined. Foreign competition increased. Jobs disappeared. People moved to the suburbs. The city shrank. The buildings fell. That's just how it goes. That narrative erases the policy choices. It makes redlining invisible. It treats white flight as neutral preference instead of racially motivated exodus. It ignores the federal subsidies that built the suburbs while starving the cities. The mansions on Millionaire's Row were built by wealthy men who made their fortunes in lumber, automotive parts, banking, and manufacturing. They hired architects. They imported stone from South Dakota and marble from Vermont. They installed Tiffany glass and hand-carved woodwork. They spent the equivalent of tens of millions of today's dollars building palaces meant to last generations. Those same mansions were maintained by workers earning $8 to $12 per week. Black workers who could not use the front entrance, immigrant workers who lived in crowded neighborhoods where the houses were chopped into multiple units, workers who rode streetcars before dawn and returned after dark, keeping the machinery of wealthy households running while remaining invisible. When the wealthy families left, the workers stayed, but the workers had been locked out of home ownership by federal policy. They had been denied access to the FHA mortgages that built suburban wealth. They had been forced into specific neighborhoods by redlining and racial covenants. The neighborhoods where black workers could live were marked hazardous on government maps. Banks would not lend there. Property values were suppressed. Maintenance was deferred. When white flight accelerated after 1967, those neighborhoods lost what little investment they had. The mansions fell because the system that created them was built on exploitation. And when the exploited population gained enough numbers to change the political balance, the people who benefited from exploitation fled. They took their tax dollars to suburbs protected by racial covenants. They left the city to collapse. That is the mechanism. Not mysterious, not inevitable, documented in census data, HOLC maps, FHA policies, and city budgets. The third crime is what we choose to memorialize. Walk through what is left of Millionaire's Row today. A few mansions have historical markers. The plaques talk about architectural styles. Romanesque Revival, Victorian Gothic. They mention the wealthy families. David Whitney Jr., lumber baron. Colonel Frank J. Hecker, railroad executive. The plaques rarely mention the workers. The housemaids and cooks and chauffeurs and gardeners whose labor made the mansions function. The black workers who could not use the front door. The immigrant workers who lived in neighborhoods the wealthy families never visited. The historical narrative centers the wealthy and erases the workers. It preserves the names of the exploiters and forgets the exploited. The same erasure happens with the destruction narrative. We talk about urban decay. We use passive language. The buildings fell. The neighborhood declined. The city lost population. We do not name the federal officials who designed the redlining system. We do not list the FHA administrators who approved racially restrictive covenants. We do not identify the city officials who approved demolitions instead of preservation. We do not hold accountable the developers who burned buildings for insurance money. The destruction was not passive. It was active. People made decisions. Those decisions had names attached. The HOLC maps have signatures. The demolition permits have approval stamps. The insurance claims have adjusters' names. But we treat the destruction as if it happened naturally, as if cities just decay without policy choices accelerating and directing that decay. That is the forgetting we choose. Detroit in 1920 had Millionaire's Row. Detroit in 2024 has parking lots and a handful of survivors. The distance between those two realities is not time. It is policy. Federal redlining, FHA racial covenants, white flight, arson, demolition. Each one a choice. The crime is not that we cannot reverse history. You cannot rebuild demolished mansions. You cannot resurrect burned structures. The crime is that we keep telling the story wrong. We say Detroit declined. We should say Detroit was systematically disinvested by federal policy that redirected resources to white suburbs. We say people moved to the suburbs. We should say white families fled, using FHA mortgages denied to black families, and suburbs used racial covenants to maintain segregation. We say the buildings fell. We should say owners burned them for insurance money after decades of disinvestment made restoration financially impossible. Language matters. Passive voice hides responsibility. Active voice names it. The real crime of Millionaire's Row is not the loss of beautiful buildings. It is the loss of the true story. The replacement of documented policy decisions with vague narratives about natural decline. The centering of wealthy families and the erasure of workers. The forgetting of names, dates, and mechanisms. What remains of Millionaire's Row stands as evidence. The Whitney Mansion proves preservation is possible. The empty lots prove destruction was policy. The few boarded mansions waiting for prove we are still making choices about what to save and what to let die. Detroit's richest street became Detroit's most erased street. Not by accident, by design. The designers had names. The policies had dates. The outcomes were predictable and predicted. That is the story we should remember. Not as tragedy, as crime, with perpetrators, victims, and evidence, all documented, all available, all waiting for anyone willing to look past the official narrative and read the actual history. The mansions are mostly gone. The people who built them and the people who cleaned them are all dead. But the policies that killed Millionaire's Row are still with us, still shaping cities, still deciding which neighborhoods get investment and which get abandonment. That is why the story matters, not to mourn beautiful buildings, but to understand how we build systems of exploitation, how we maintain them through policy, and how we forget them through narrative. Millionaire's Row is gone. Question is whether we will remember why.